The dust hadn't settled when the radio crackled with static that made every man in Outpost Reacher freeze. Lieutenant Marcus Halford pressed his hand against the sandbag wall, feeling the vibrations of distant artillery through the earth itself. The Taliban had been probing their perimeter for 3 days, testing weak points, watching patterns. Now, in the copper light of an Afghan dawn, the enemy had stopped probing. 200 fighters encircled the outpost in a tightening noose, and the 37 soldiers inside knew what silence before a storm sounded like. Halford keyed his radio, voice steady despite the sweat tracking down his spine. Viper 6, this is Reacher Actual. We are danger close on all sides. Request immediate air support. The response came through layers of static, a voice from Bagram that might as well have been from another planet. Reacher Actual, be advised. Closest fast movers are 23 minutes out. Apache flight is 17 minutes. Can you hold? Halford looked at his men, boys really, some of them barely old enough to buy beer back home, now checking magazines and tightening chin straps with the mechanical precision of those who'd accepted their situation. The compound walls were 10 feet of mud, brick, and prayer. The machine gun nests had good fields of fire but not enough ammunition for a sustained assault. He could see movement in the tree line, shadows gathering like a dark tide. Negative on 17 minutes, Halford said quietly. We need support now or there won't be anyone left to support. That's when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong in this moment, something that made the radio operator, a kid from Detroit named Morrison, look up with confusion written across his dust-caked face. It was laughter, brief and crackling, cutting through the tactical channel. Then a voice, female, with an accent that carried the rolling hills of somewhere back home. Reacher Actual, this is Sabbath 9-1. I'm 8 minutes out and I've got teeth. Halford frowned at the call sign. Sabbath, he'd never heard of that unit. Sabbath 9-1, what's your platform? There was a pause and he could almost hear the smile in her response. A-10 Warthog, sweetheart, and I understand you boys have a pest problem. The radio chatter that followed told Halford everything he needed to know about how the brass felt about Sabbath 9-1. Command was already trying to redirect her, suggesting she loiter at altitude until the F-16s arrived, providing reconnaissance only. Protocol dictated coordination, they said. Rules of engagement required visual confirmation through proper channels, but Sabbath 9-1 wasn't responding to those suggestions. She was descending. Halford could hear it in the changing pitch of her transmissions, the way her voice competed with wind noise that meant her cockpit was screaming through thinner air. Sabbath 9-1, command advises you maintain 15,000 feet pending row confirmation, the Bagram controller said with bureaucratic precision. Copy that, command. I'm sure you advise lots of things. I'm going tactical. Her radio went silent before they could respond. Halford found himself staring at the eastern ridge, where the sun was burning away the morning haze. The enemy fire hadn't started yet, but he could feel it coming the way animals sense earthquakes. His men were in position, but positions only mattered if someone was alive to hold them. Then Morrison grabbed his sleeve and pointed skyward. Sir, is that? She came in low, so low that Halford initially mistook her for a shadow cast by the rising sun. The A-10 Thunderbolt II emerged from the canyon's mouth like something prehistoric, wings level, nose slightly down. The aircraft looked brutally functional in a way modern fighters didn't, all hard angles and exposed weaponry. Twin turbofan engines sat high on the fuselage like the shoulders of something built to take punishment. The titanium bathtub protecting the cockpit caught the early light, and beneath the wings, he could see the ordnance stations loaded heavy. But what struck him most was the paint scheme. Most A-10s wore standard camouflage or air superiority gray. This one's nose was decorated with artwork he couldn't quite make out from this distance, and along the fuselage ran a series of small symbols in neat rows. Reacher Actual, I've got eyes on your position, Sabbath 9-1 transmitted. Her voice had changed, all business now, the humor burned away by focus. I'm seeing approximately 180 enemy personnel in tree line bearing 090 through 180 degrees from your perimeter. Multiple PKM positions, at least 4 mortar teams, and what looks like two technical vehicles with mounted weapons. Confirm. Halford raised his binoculars and scanned the terrain. He'd known they were surrounded, but seeing the scope of it laid out in her matter-of-fact assessment made his stomach clench. Confirmed, Sabbath. They're everywhere. The A-10 banked right, and he watched it slide across the sky with a grace that seemed impossible for something so mechanical, so weighted with purpose. The aircraft appeared to hang in the air for a moment, presenting its profile. That's when he saw the artwork clearly. A woman's face, vintage style like something from World War II knows art, but this woman wore a modern flight helmet and a slight smile that suggested she knew a secret. Beneath it, written in flowing script, Sabbath's sermon. Those mortars are about 30 seconds from firing solution, she said. I'm going to ruin their morning before they ruin yours. Keep your boys' heads down. This is going to be loud. Halford keyed the company net. All positions, incoming friendly fire support. Stay in cover. He heard Morrison muttering beside him. That pilot sounds like my sister. Think it's really a woman flying that thing, Specialist Chen, manning the nearest machine gun, snorted. Don't matter what's flying it as long as she shoots straight. But Halford could hear the uncertainty beneath the bravado. The military had opened combat aviation to women years ago, but out here in the sharp end of nowhere, most of these men had never seen it up close. They were wondering the same thing he was. Could she really do what needed doing? The A-10 rolled inverted, and Halford watched gravity and physics work in ways that made his inner ear rebel. She was lining up from north to south, putting the sun behind her, approaching the enemy positions from their blind side. Professional, smart, aggressive. Everything he needed and nothing he dared hope for when the radio had crackled to life. Guns, 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 she transmitted, her voice flat and cold as winter steel. The sound reached them a fraction of a second before the visual. The GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon was the reason the A-10 existed. 7 barrels cycling at nearly 4,000 rounds per minute, firing 30 depleted uranium rounds that could shred armor and disintegrate cover. The weapon's distinctive BRRRRT was deeper than thunder, more primal, a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the gut. Halford watched the tracer stream, every fifth round glowing red as it poured into the tree line like liquid fire. Trees exploded into splinters, earth fountained skyward, and the enemy position simply ceased to exist in a rolling wave of destruction. She held the trigger for 3 seconds. In that time, she'd fired approximately 200 rounds into an area the size of a football field, each round capable of punching through concrete. They pulled up sharply, engine screaming as she climbed away from her gun run. Smoke and dust billowed from the eastern tree line, and through his binoculars, Halford could see bodies and weapons scattered like a child's dropped toys. East side mortars are neutralized, she reported, breathing slightly harder now, the G-forces of her pull-up evident in her voice. Moving to southern technical vehicles, marking my next run. The enemy responded then, as Halford knew they would. Tracer fire rose from multiple positions, green and orange streams reaching toward the A-10 as it carved across the sky. Small arms fire mostly, effective as throwing rocks at a falcon. The Taliban weren't stupid, though. Someone down there had to have a MANPAD, a shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile that could turn that armored bird into scrap metal. Sabbath, be advised you've got heavy ground fire, he transmitted. Possible surface-to-air threat. Her laugh came back, short and sharp. Honey, I was born in ground fire. These boys couldn't hit me with a ladder. The A-10 jinked left, then right, not the wild, evasive maneuvers of a fighter jet but calculated adjustments that kept her platform stable while making her path unpredictable. She came in from the west this time, nose pointed at the 2 pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns that had been positioning to rake the outpost's southern wall. The Taliban fighters around the vehicles scattered, but there was nowhere to run that mattered. Paveways away, she called. Halford watched the AGM-65 Maverick missiles drop from her wings, self-correcting in flight as their guidance systems locked onto the infrared signatures of the vehicles. The missiles hit 3 seconds apart. The first truck vaporized in a fireball that sent its machine gun tumbling end over end through the air. The second truck's fuel tank caught, and the explosion was larger, more dramatic, black smoke rising in a mushroom that could probably be seen from Kabul. "Direct hits," Halford confirmed, and he heard his own voice shake slightly. "Southern threat eliminated." The Taliban fighters were breaking now. He could see them through the smoke, some running toward the mountains, others diving into irrigation ditches and spider holes. But Sabbath 9-1 wasn't finished. She brought the A-10 around in a combat turn that seemed to bend reality, lining up on the western tree line where the enemy's reserve force was desperately trying to establish a new firing position. "This one's with the rockets," she said. The Hydra 70 rockets rippled off her wings in a sequence that looked almost beautiful, 7 contrails drawing geometric patterns across the morning sky, before they impacted in a rolling barrage that marched through the western positions like the footsteps of something divine and terrible. Each explosion was smaller than the Mavericks, but there were so many of them, overlapping, creating a curtain of fire that nothing living could walk through. When the smoke cleared, the western tree line looked like the surface of the moon, cratered and burning. "Reacher actual," she transmitted, her breathing heavier now. "I'm Winchester on rockets and Mavericks. Still have 30mm in time. What do you need?" Halford scanned his perimeter. The enemy assault had shattered before it could even begin. Bodies littered the approaches, vehicles burned like signal fires, and the survivors were in full retreat. She'd been on station for maybe 4 minutes and had single-handedly broken a force that outnumbered them 6-1. "Sabbath 9-1, he said slowly. "I think you've done enough. We've got this now." There was a pause, and when she spoke again, he heard something different in her voice. Not exhaustion exactly, but a kind of satisfaction that came from purpose fulfilled. "Copy that, Reacher. The cavalry has arrived anyway. You've got a Apache inbound, 2 minutes out. I'm going to orbit high and make sure no one gets any smart ideas about coming back." The A-10 climbed away from the battlefield, gaining altitude in a wide spiral that kept the outpost in sight. Halford watched it go, that ugly, beautiful machine with its Sunday school call sign and its devastating precision. Morrison was staring too, his weapon lowered, something like wonder on his young face. "Sir," he said quietly. "Who the hell was that?" Halford shook his head. "I don't know, Morrison, but remind me to buy her a drink if we ever get back to Bagram." The Apache arrived exactly on schedule, sleek and predatory, bristling with weapons. They made contact with Sabbath 9-1, and Halford listened to the professional exchange of battlefield information. The Apache pilots sounded respectful, almost deferential. They knew what she'd done. Everyone monitoring this frequency knew. Command broke in then, the same controller from earlier, and his tone had changed. No more suggestions about altitude and protocol. "Sabbath 9-1, Command. Outstanding work. RTB when ready." "Negative, Command," she replied. "I'm going to stay up here until Reacher is secure. I've got another hour of fuel." Halford smiled despite himself. She wasn't leaving until the job was completely finished. Professional pride or something deeper, he couldn't tell. Maybe both. The cleanup took 3 hours. The Apache prowled the perimeter, hunting stragglers. Medevac helicopters arrived to take out the 2 casualties Reacher Actual had sustained, both from the initial probing attacks days ago, nothing from this morning. It was, by any measure, a miracle written in cannon fire and precision ordnance. Halford was coordinating with the Apache flight leader when he saw the descending again. For a moment, he thought something was wrong, that she'd taken damage he hadn't seen. But her approach was controlled, easy, and she keyed the radio with something almost like hesitation in her voice. "Reacher Actual, this is Sabbath 9-1. Permission to make a low pass." He glanced at Morrison, who shrugged. Sure, Sabbath. We're secure here. What's on your mind?" The A-10 dropped to 500 feet and came in from the north, wings level, gear up. As she passed overhead, close enough that Halford could see the cockpit clearly, she rocked her wings. Left, right, left again. The traditional aviator's salute, the gesture that meant respect and solidarity, and a dozen other things that couldn't be said over a radio. Halford raised his hand, knowing she probably couldn't see him but doing it anyway. Every man in the outpost was watching now, and several of them raised their hands too, saluting the aircraft as it roared past with that distinctive turbofan whine that meant an A-10 was nearby and everything was going to be okay. She climbed away toward Bagram and the radio chatter returned to normal. Logistics, medevac status reports, ammunition counts, all the boring necessary business of survival, but Morrison was still staring at the sky where she disappeared. "I want to know who that was," the kid said. "Like her actual name, someone that good we should know who they are." Chen had joined them, his weapon slung now, helmet pushed back on his head. "Good luck with that. You hear her call sign, Sabbath. That's personal, means something specific." Lieutenant Halford didn't say anything, but he made a mental note. When they rotated back to Bagram, he'd find out who Sabbath 91 was. Because Morrison was right. Someone who just saved 37 lives deserved more than an anonymous radio call sign and a burst transmission of gratitude. She deserved to be known. The sun was fully up now, burning away the smoke and the gun haze, turning the mountains gold and the sky that particular shade of blue that existed nowhere else on Earth. Afghanistan was beautiful in its way, harsh and unforgiving but beautiful. And somewhere in that sky, banking toward home base with empty weapons stations and a lighter fuel load, Sabbath 91 was probably thinking about the same thing. The debrief at Bagram started with coffee and ended with silence. Halford had expected questions, maybe some pushback about the chaos of the engagement, but instead he got nods and knowing looks from officers who'd been doing this longer than he'd been alive. The Air Force liaison, a major named Patterson with 20 years and a chest full of ribbons, pulled him aside after the formal session ended. "Your pilot," Patterson said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Sabbath 91, did she say anything else, anything personal?" Halford frowned. "No, sir, professional the whole way through." "Why?" Patterson seemed to wrestle with something internal, then sighed. "Because that call sign means something most people don't know about. Sabbath's been over here for 3 tours, flying A-10s out of Kandahar and Bagram. Real name's Captain Miriam Koval. She's got more combat hours in the hog than anyone currently deployed, and her kill count on enemy armor and fortifications is classified but probably higher than some entire squadrons." "Why Sabbath?" Halford asked. Patterson smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Her grandfather flew B-17s in World War II. Tail gunner, shot down over Germany, spent 2 years in a POW camp. When he came home, he used to tell her that Saturday was his Sabbath, his day of rest, his day of peace. Said that after what he'd seen, keeping one day sacred was the only thing that kept him sane. So she named herself after rest," Halford said. "That doesn't make sense for someone who flies like that." Patterson shook his head. "You're not hearing it right, Lieutenant. She named herself Sabbath as a reminder that peace is worth fighting for. That rest is earned. She flies Sunday through Friday, no exceptions unless maintenance grounds her bird. Saturdays she doesn't fly. Doesn't matter if there's a mission fragged, doesn't matter if command begs. She keeps that one day sacred in honor of the old man who taught her what war really costs." Halford felt something shift in his understanding. The call sign wasn't bravado or humor. It was philosophy, personal and deep. "She any good at taking Saturdays off?" "Not particularly," Patterson admitted. "Most Saturdays you'll find her in the hangar, helping the maintenance crews, or in the squadron spaces, mentoring younger pilots. She doesn't fly, but she doesn't exactly rest either. It's complicated." That evening, Halford made his way to the Air Force section of Bagram, past the neat rows of fighters and cargo planes, to where the A-10s sat like armored bulldogs waiting for work. He found Sabbath's sermon easily. It was the one surrounded by maintainers, its panels open, its weapons stations being reloaded. The nose art was even more striking up close. The woman's face was rendered in precise detail, not cartoonish but artistic, and her eyes seemed to follow you with an expression that was both fierce and somehow compassionate. Below the artwork, small bomb symbols marched in neat rows. He counted 47. 47 confirmed kills, everything from tanks to bunkers to technical vehicles. And beside them, different symbols, a simple cross repeated over and over. He counted those too. 18. Captain Miriam Koval was sitting on the crew ladder, watching her maintainers work. She was smaller than he'd imagined from her voice. maybe 5'4", lean in the way runners were lean, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun and eyes that had that thousand-yard quality of someone who'd seen too much too clearly. "Captain Koval," Halford approached carefully, suddenly uncertain. She looked up and recognition flickered across her face. "Reacher Actual, Lieutenant Halford, right? I looked up your roster after the flight." She stood, offered her hand. Her grip was firm, calloused from stick and throttle. "I wanted to thank you," Halford said, "for this morning. You saved a lot of lives." She nodded, accepting the gratitude without false modesty or deflection. "That's the job. You guys did good holding them until I could get there. 3 days under siege, that's not nothing." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the maintainers load a fresh Maverick onto her wing station. One of them, a tech sergeant with graying temples, looked over and grinned. "Captain Koval here's got a talent for showing up exactly when the devil's knocking. We keep her bird running sharp because we know somebody out there needs her sharp." Koval smiled slightly. "Martinez flatters me because I bring back his airplane in mostly one piece." "Mostly," Martinez agreed. "Those bullet holes from last week are mostly." Halford noticed the patches on the fuselage then, fresh aluminum riveted over older damage. The A-10 was famous for its toughness, but this bird had clearly tested those limits. He pointed at the crosses beside the kill markers. "What do those mean?" Koval's expression shifted, became more guarded. "Missions where I got someone home. Medevac covers, troops in contact, that kind of thing. The bombs are for equipment I destroyed. The crosses are for people I saved. I like to remember both." 18, Halford said softly. Koval looked at him directly. 18 times I was in the right place at the right moment to make a difference. Could be luck, could be something else. My grandfather used to say that grace moves in mysterious ways, but it always moves with purpose. I choose to believe him. The next Saturday, Halford had a day off and found himself walking through Bagram's base chapel area. It was a quiet place, non-sectarian, with space for every faith and none. He found Captain Koval sitting on a bench outside, reading a worn paperback that looked like it had survived multiple deployments. She glanced up as he approached, marked her page with a postcard, and smiled. "Lieutenant, you're not stalking me, are you?" "No, ma'am, just exploring. Didn't expect to see you here." She patted the bench beside her. "Saturdays, I try to remember what peace feels like. Sometimes that means chapel, sometimes it means the gym, sometimes it means hiding in my hooch and reading terrible novels. Today, it's this." She held up the book. He couldn't read the title, but the cover suggested science fiction. "You really don't fly on Saturdays." "Haven't for 3 years. Not since I really understood what my grandfather was trying to teach me." She looked at the sky, that omnipresent blue. When you fly combat missions 6 days a week, when you spend your life dealing out violence even for good reasons, you need a reset button, something that reminds you what you're fighting for. My grandfather's reset was Saturdays. Mine is too. "But you still come to base," Halford observed. "You still work." "I work on me," she corrected. "I help others when they need it. I study and read and remember what life is supposed to be like when bullets aren't flying. It's different than the other 6 days. That difference matters." A pair of F-16s launched in the distance, afterburners painting temporary stars against the afternoon sky. Koval watched them without apparent envy. "You ever think about after?" Halford asked. "After the war, after the flying." She was quiet for a long moment. "Every single day. But the war's not over and people still need close air support, and I'm very good at what I do. So I stay. I fly. I keep one day sacred and give the other 6 to whoever needs them." Word spread through Reacher Outpost about the pilot who'd saved them, and word spread through Bagram about Halford's unit and the desperate fight they'd survived. In the strange mathematics of military reputation, Sabbath 9-1's legend grew. Pilots who'd never met her knew the story. Ground troops who'd never keyed a radio to her frequency knew the call sign. She'd become more than a person. She'd become a symbol of the thing everyone needed to believe in. That when everything went to hell, someone would answer the call. But Captain Miriam Koval didn't seem to notice or care about her growing reputation. She flew her missions, maintained her Sabbath rest, and treated every desperate call for help with the same focused intensity she'd brought to Outpost Reacher. 3 weeks after the siege, she scrambled for a troops-in-contact situation near Kandahar. 5 days after that, she provided overwatch for a convoy that had rolled into an IED ambush. The 19th cross appeared on Sabbath Sermon's fuselage, then the 20th. The bomb count climbed 2, 54, 59, 63. Martinez and his maintenance crew started joking that they needed to add a second row of symbols because they were running out of room. But they didn't joke where Koval could hear them, because they all understood that every symbol represented moments where life and death had balanced on the edge of her skill and her aircraft's capability. That fall, command started pressuring her to accept a promotion, to rotate back to the States and train the next generation of A-10 pilots. She declined. Twice. 3 times. Patterson, the Air Force liaison, came to Halford one evening looking exhausted. "Your pilot's turning down oak leaves," he said without preamble. "Major's bars, squadron commander track, the whole career path. She just wants to keep flying combat missions." "Can't say I'm surprised," Halford replied. "She seems like the type who knows what she wants." "That's the problem," Patterson said. "What she wants is going to get her killed. She's flown more combat hours than anyone should fly. Her stress evaluations are fine, her performance is outstanding, but sooner or later luck runs out. The A-10 might be tough, but it's not indestructible. Neither is she." Halford thought about that. About the way Koval had looked at her aircraft, the way she'd talked about her grandfather and Sabbaths, and the weight of carrying violence 6 days a week. "Maybe she knows that better than anyone," he said. Patterson left shaking his head, and Halford wondered if he should have said something different, something that might have convinced the major to leave Koval alone. But he also knew it wasn't his choice to make. Some people were built for war in ways that defied easy explanation. They weren't broken or damaged necessarily. They were just fundamentally different, wired to find purpose in chaos and meaning in the space between heartbeats where decisions happened. The next Saturday he found her again, this time at the base gym. She was running on a treadmill, earbuds in, pace steady and methodical. He waited until she finished, and when she stepped off the machine, she pulled the earbuds free and smiled at him. "You're making this stalking thing a habit, Lieutenant. Just wanted to check on you. Heard command's been hassling you about promotion." Her smile faded slightly. "They mean well. They see someone who's good at the job and want to promote them into positions where they can't do the job anymore. It's the military way. You could train others, pass on what you know." "I do that already," she said. "Every mission I fly, every younger pilot who monitors the frequency and learns from the calls I make, every maintainer who sees what a well-flown bird can accomplish, that's training. That's legacy. I don't need a classroom for that." She grabbed her water bottle, drank deeply. "Besides, who'd cover Saturdays for guys like you?" November brought snow to the mountains and a shift in Taliban tactics. They'd learned that massed assaults brought American air power down like the wrath of God, so they went smaller, more surgical. Ambushes in narrow valleys, quick strikes on isolated checkpoints, attacks timed to happen during weather windows when air support couldn't respond. Koval's sortie rate decreased slightly, but the missions she flew became more complex, more dangerous. She started carrying different ordnance loads, more rockets, fewer Mavericks, configurations designed for close support in terrain where there was no margin for error. The 24th cross appeared on her aircraft. Then the 25th. Her bomb count reached 70. Martinez confided to Halford during a chance encounter that he was running out of space even with the compressed symbols, and command was considering commissioning a larger nose art piece to accommodate Koval's growing tally. "She won't like that," Martinez said. "Cap'n doesn't fly for the numbers. She flies because it matters, making a big deal about the count that feels wrong to her." "Then don't tell her," Halford suggested. "Just do what you need to do, she'll understand." But Martinez shook his head. "That bird's as much hers as it is the Air Force's. We don't change things without asking." In early December, a dust storm grounded most operations for 3 days. Koval spent the time in the maintenance hangar, and when Halford visited, he found her with her hands deep in an auxiliary power unit, helping diagnose a fault that had been plaguing the backup A-10. "I thought pilots didn't do mechanic work," he said. She looked up, face smudged with grease, looking more at peace than he'd ever seen her. Good pilots know their machines. Great pilots love their machines enough to get their hands dirty. She went back to work, and Martinez, supervising nearby, caught Halford's eye and nodded slowly. The message was clear. This woman wasn't just a pilot. She was something rarer, someone who understood that war was fought by people and machines together, and respect for both was what made the difference between surviving and thriving in impossible situations. The dust storm broke on a Saturday. Koval kept her Sabbath, despite the backlog of missions that had piled up during the weather delay. Other A-10 pilots flew, and they flew well, but everyone from privates to colonels was waiting for Sunday, when Sabbath 9-1 would be back in the air. Halford realized then that she'd become essential in a way that transcended normal military structure. She was a force multiplier not just in tactical terms, but in morale, in the simple knowledge that when she was airborne, someone had your back with absolute reliability. Sunday came with clear skies and crisp cold air that made aircraft performance sharp and predictable. Koval's first mission of the day was a routine patrol, flying top cover for a supply convoy. Routine lasted 40 minutes. Any Sabbath flight, this is Paladin 2-6, troops in contact, heavy casualties, requesting immediate air support. The desperation in the voice cut through the radio like a blade. Halford, monitoring from the Tactical Operations Center, heard Koval's response without hesitation. Paladin 2-6, Sabbath 9-1, send your location and situation. The grid coordinates put the fight in a valley system 30 miles north, terrain so rugged that helicopters couldn't operate safely. Paladin 2-6 was a special forces team that had been compromised during a reconnaissance mission, now pinned down by a superior force with wounded they couldn't evacuate. The team leader's voice was professionally calm, but Halford could hear the edges of fear beneath the training. Sabbath, we've got 12 personnel, 4 wounded, approximately 60 enemy with heavy weapons and a technical. The valley's too narrow for fast movers. We need someone who can work close, very close. Koval didn't hesitate. Copy, Paladin, I'm 8 minutes out. Talk me onto target. What followed was a masterclass in close air support. Koval entered the valley at 500 feet, threading the A-10 between ridgelines that rose another 1,000 feet on either side. The margin for error was measured in yards, and one mistake would smear her across granite at 300 knots. Visual on your position, Paladin, she transmitted. I see your smoke. Enemy is in the tree line north side of your pose, mixed in with civilian structures. Structures are abandoned, the team leader confirmed. Area is weapons-free. The A-10 came in perpendicular to the valley, cross-axis to maximize her time on target while minimizing her exposure to ground fire. She pickled rockets first, walking them up the enemy line with precision that seemed impossible given the angles involved. Each impact was placed exactly where it needed to be, far enough from the SF team to be safe, close enough to neutralize the threat. Good hits, Sabbath. Enemy is breaking east. I see them. She brought the aircraft around in a turn so tight that her wingtip seemed to brush the valley wall, and as she rolled out, the GAU-8 spoke again. The 13 rounds chewed through the fleeing enemy force, and the technical vehicle exploded in a secondary blast that suggested it had been carrying ammunition. Technical destroyed, enemy neutralized, she reported. Paladin, what's your egress route? The Special Forces team leader gave her coordinates, and for the next 20 minutes, Koval orbited the valley while the team extracted with their wounded. She didn't fire again, didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to keep any remaining enemy fighters hidden and cautious. When the team reached their extraction point and the helicopters swept in to collect them, the team leader keyed the radio one final time. Sabbath 9-1, Paladin 2-6. You just saved 12 lives and kept 4 men from dying in a ditch. We won't forget this. Koval's response was quiet, almost private. 29th time I've heard that, Paladin. I hope I hear it 100 more. Get your boys home safe. She climbed out of the valley and returned to her patrol route, and listening to the radio exchanges, Halford understood something profound. The crosses on her aircraft weren't about pride or record-keeping. They were about memory, about refusing to let the weight of what she did become abstract or statistical. Every cross was a moment when she'd been the difference, and she carried them all. That night in the operations center, he overheard two junior Air Force officers talking about Koval. One of them, fresh from the States with maybe 10 combat missions under his belt, was complaining that she made the rest of them look bad. "She flies like she's got nothing to lose," the lieutenant said. "Takes risks that would get anyone else grounded. Command lets her get away with it because of her reputation." His companion, a captain who'd been deployed longer, shut him down immediately. "She flies like she's got everything to lose, our lives, her aircraft, her crew chief's faith in her. Every risk she takes is calculated, and she's been calculating longer than you've been in uniform. Watch her gun camera footage sometime. Watch how she positions every run, how she manages her energy and her ordnance. That's not recklessness, that's mastery." The lieutenant fell silent, chastened, and Halford felt a small satisfaction. Koval's skill wasn't just something people felt. It was something that could be studied, analyzed, proven. She wasn't lucky or crazy. She was simply the best at what she did, and the best earned their reputations one decision at a time. Christmas approached, and with it came a series of Taliban offensives designed to disrupt coalition operations during the holiday period. The tempo increased dramatically, and Koval flew double missions on several days, landing only to refuel and rearm before launching again. The crosses and bombs on Sabbath's sermon accumulated rapidly. 31 crosses, 34, 78 bombs, 82. Martinez and his crew were working 18-hour days to keep her aircraft mission ready, and the strain was beginning to show on everyone, except Koval herself. She kept her Saturdays sacred, without fail, even as other pilots flew surge schedules 7 days a week. Some command officers grumbled about it, but Patterson defended her fiercely, pointing out that her 6-day workload exceeded most pilots' 7-day schedules, and her 1 day of rest probably contributed to the consistency of her performance. The debate became moot on December 23rd. Koval scrambled for what was supposed to be a quick interdiction mission, enemy supply convoy moving through an uncontrolled area, straightforward strike, minimal risk. She never made it to the target. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Sabbath 9-1. Her voice on the emergency frequency was strained but controlled. "I've taken AAA fire, starboard engine is out, hydraulics are degraded. I'm attempting to maintain altitude." Halford's blood went cold. He was in the TOC when the call came through, and he watched the operations officers leap into action, scrambling rescue assets, calculating distance and fuel, running through protocols designed for exactly this nightmare scenario. "Sabbath 9-1, what's your position?" Command asked. She read off coordinates that put her over mountainous terrain with no good landing sites. The A-10 could fly on one engine, but damaged hydraulics meant her flight controls were compromised. She was essentially trying to control tons of metal and weapons with degraded systems in some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. "I'm going to try to make it to Fob Cobra," she transmitted. "It's 30 miles, but it's the closest friendly airstrip. If I can't make it, I'll point the bird at the mountains and punch out." The radio went silent for 30 seconds that felt like 30 hours. Then, "Scratch that. I've got a village below me, civilian populated. If I eject and the bird crashes there." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Everyone listening understood what she was saying. She wasn't going to abandon an aircraft full of fuel and unexpended ordnance over innocent people, even if it meant risking her own life. "Sabbath command. You are authorized to eject. Repeat, you are authorized to eject. We'll manage the crash site." "Negative," she said flatly. "I'm bringing her home or I'm putting her somewhere empty. Those are the only two options." What followed was 15 minutes of the most stressful flying Halford had ever witnessed, even second-hand through radio transmissions. Koval coaxed the damaged A-10 across the mountains, bleeding altitude slowly, nursing the remaining engine fighting flight controls that were becoming less responsive with every mile. She talked through her actions, partly for the benefit of command, partly because talking kept her focused. Her voice remained steady even as the aircraft betrayed her one system at a time. The right main landing gear wouldn't deploy. The left aileron was frozen. The backup hydraulic system was failing. Each problem was manageable individually, but together they represented a cascading failure that would have overwhelmed most pilots. Koval adapted to each new challenge with a calmness that suggested either supreme confidence or complete acceptance of her fate. Halford suspected it was both. "Fob Cobra, this is Sabbath 9-1, 5 miles out. I'm going to make a straighten approach, no pattern, no go-around option. Clear the runway and have fire equipment standing by." The forward operating base's tower controller sounded young and scared. "Sabbath 9-1, Cobra Tower. Runway is clear, emergency equipment is positioned. We're ready for you." The final approach was flown entirely on the edge of physics. Koval kept the A-10's nose up, bleeding speed, managing angle and descent rate with marginal control authority. She couldn't see the runway well because her damaged hydraulics made it difficult to adjust pitch precisely, so she was flying partially by feel, by instinct, by a lifetime of experience compressed into seconds of decision. The A-10 touched down hard on its left main gear and nose wheel, the right side dragging. Sparks fountained from the contact point where metal met concrete, and the aircraft slewed sideways. Koval fought it with rudder and differential braking, using every trick she knew to keep the machine on the pavement instead of cartwheeling into the dirt. 2,000 feet of runway became 1,000, then 500, and the A-10 was still sliding, still trying to swap ends. At the 200-foot marker, physics and pilot reached an agreement. The aircraft stopped, angled across the runway, emergency equipment already converging but stopped. Intact. Survivable. The radio crackled. "Sabbath 9-1 is down safe." Her voice was shaking now, adrenaline finally breaking through the professional calm. "Gear's a mess, right engine scrap, but I'm okay. The bird saved my life." Halford realized he'd been holding his breath and he wasn't alone. Around him, hardened officers and sergeants were exhaling, some closing their eyes, some wiping sweat from foreheads. They just listened to Captain Miriam Koval thread a needle that should have been impossible, and she'd done it because the alternative was unacceptable. That was the moment Halford understood she wasn't just skilled. She was different in a fundamental way. She carried a code that didn't bend regardless of personal cost. The investigation into the incident concluded that Koval had been hit by a burst of 23 anti-aircraft fire that had damaged her starboard engine and severed multiple hydraulic lines. The damage pattern suggested the shooter had gotten lucky, but luck cut both ways, and Koval's skill had turned what should have been a fatal hit into merely a career-defining moment. Sabbath's sermon was declared a total loss despite Koval's successful landing. The cumulative damage from multiple deployments, plus the catastrophic failure of critical systems, meant the airframe's structural integrity was compromised beyond economical repair. Martinez and his crew spent 3 days stripping the usable parts and recovering the nose art, which they carefully preserved. Koval watched the process in silence, standing at a distance, arms crossed, face unreadable. When they finally towed the stripped hulk away for scrap, she walked up to Martinez and said simply, "Thank you for taking care of her." "Cap'n," Martinez replied, voice rough, "that bird loved you right back. She brought you home when she had no business flying at all. That's what love looks like in metal and rivets." Koval nodded, turned away, and Halford, watching from the operations building, saw her raise one hand to her face, just for a moment. Just long enough to wipe away something that might have been dust or might have been more. Command immediately assigned her another A-10 from the reserve pool, a newer airframe with less history but solid maintenance records. Koval accepted it with professional courtesy, but without the connection she'd clearly felt for Sabbath's sermon. The new bird was just an aircraft. The old one had been a partner. She flew her first mission in the new A-10 on a Thursday, a routine combat air patrol that resulted in no enemy contact and no drama. But when she returned and shut down the engines, she sat in the cockpit for a long time before climbing out.